Welcome to the Pathways to Stillness podcast series. I'm Dr. Gary Irwin Kenyon. I created this series as a follow-up to my book, Pathways to Stillness, Reflect, Release, Renew, which is available on Amazon, Indigo, and Friesen Press, and in audiobook form from Amazon, Audible, and iTunes. In this series of episodes, I am in conversation with my friend and colleague, Bill Randal. We explore pathways, or what Thomas Moore calls in another episode of this podcast, meanderings of our personal and collaborative journey with the metaphor of life as a story, and the wonderful adventure that is possible if you are open to following your bliss. In this first episode, we explore the beginnings of the story.
So I like to talk about the story of my interest in stories. And when I think back, over my life, I think that this interest in stories has been a major or a minor theme, a central theme of one sort or other for, a good chunk of my life. I grew up in rural New Brunswick in a good maritime village, and I like to remind myself and others that there's something I think special about the environment of rural maritime communities. The storied complexity of life is kind of in your face. Everybody knows everybody's business, or they make it their business to know it if they don't. So that's the kind of community that I grew up in. But I got a double dose of story richness, I think, because my father was a Protestant minister in the one community where we lived for 20 years. And he himself was a very talented raconteur. He could take the most sort of innocuous everyday event or conversation and turn it into quite an amusing story. So that was part of our environment in our family as well. Growing up as a son of the manse, or a preacher's kid, I, of course, had lots to do with church things. And we had a little game that we would play in the youth groups I was part of, where we would, Dad would lead these groups, where we would compete with, teams, shall we say, for remembering the begats of the Old Testament. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, and so on and so forth. So I think, that was kind of a superficial way to get into the good book, so to speak, but it did make me aware that these major religions that are part of our world have stories themselves and are rooted in stories. Certainly the Bible is that way, and other works of scripture as well. So anyway, after some university time, I decided that I would go to study theology myself. And I realized, this was in the mid-'70s, that there was something at that time just starting up, shall we say, called narrative theology or story theology. And I thought, this kind of resonates with me. So I did a thesis in my final year of seminary, looking into my story, our story, and the story, which sounds like a kind of a pretentious title when I think back upon it now. But it really did, it got me very excited to think of spirituality and theology and the religious life, in a sense, as having a story dimension to it. So I went off to start on, at least, a doctoral program in England, at the University of Cambridge, on the broad topic of autobiography and religion, which I thought would be just an easy-peasy topic to handle, but it turned out to be too much for my 26-year-old brain to put all together, so I didn't stay. I stayed for less than a year, actually, sadly. That's been kind of an unfinished chapter in my own life story. You might say, I often dream about that period. I came back to North America, did another degree where I was able to focus more on narrative theology, and then I felt the tap on the shoulder, as you could put it, to go into parish ministry myself, finally, after all of this studying. And so for starting off in rural Saskatchewan, in a huge territory in southwestern Saskatchewan under the big sky, and I realized that a good part of my work was to go visit people and get to know them, which meant basically sitting and having coffee at their kitchen table and maybe having a meal and hearing their stories and inviting them to tell me what they care to about their lives. And sometimes I had the sense that with certain individuals who maybe had particular issues they were wrestling with, that just by listening to their stories, I could help them find new directions or a new way to make sense of things that were problematic for them, or to help them to re-story in some way. That idea of re-storying, which you and I went on to write about, that started I started to realize that just listening to people's stories can facilitate a kind of a shifting of the narrative by which a person is living. In any case, after 10 plus years of that very intense work, I came back to New Brunswick, and I was in a large congregation in Fredericton. I began to be quite restless. I think I had allowed my own story to be submerged in the role of being a minister to other people. So I felt some restlessness and decided that I needed to leave that kind of work and leap out into the unknown. I was in my late 30s at this point. Eventually, I returned to university to do a doctorate at the University of Toronto, although it was quite an important chapter in my life as to how that came about. A lot of little synchronicities, as I would call them, coincidences that led to me enrolling in a doctoral program. And when it became apparent to me and to my profs that, well, maybe I should attempt a dissertation, a doctoral thesis. So the question became, well, what on? And that's when I began to remember my interest from a number of years before in narrative and story, and the story dimensions of people's lives, of their spirituality, etc. So I found myself actually becoming quite obsessed, as happens when you let your mind go wherever it wants to go. I found myself obsessed with this idea of life as a story, or the metaphor of life as story. And I could not get that out of my mind. So I read widely, I thought broadly, I began writing, and the result was a dissertation entitled "The Stories We Are," an essay on self-creation. So that was the first kind of major pulling together for me, anyway, Gary, of a lot of these ideas and hunches and insights about the centrality of stories in our lives. It was around about that time, and just thinking of our own lives as stories that we are in the middle of, making them up as we go along, as sort of author, narrator, protagonist, editor, and reader, kind of all wrapped up in one. And it was around about that time that the universe conspired for me and you to meet. And that was a very important meeting. I remember sitting having a coffee, the two of us, in Officer Square, I think in downtown metropolitan Fredericton. And we realized, this was 1994 if I'm not mistaken, we realized that we had a lot of common interests. You were a gerontologist. I was nothing in particular at that point, but I had written this thesis on the stories we are, and your interest in biographical aging seemed to kind of be a nice fit. So that led me to, well, I think I was teaching English at Seneca College in Toronto, which was a kind of a dead-end job, a great job, but it wasn't going to go anywhere, I could tell. And in 1995, and this is part of my story, this is a very important chapter, I recall you reaching out to me and wondering if I might be interested to come to St. Thomas for one semester in the fall of 1995 and to be a visiting chair in gerontology. The irony is that I had never taken a course in gerontology, let alone earned a degree in gerontology. However, I had taught some at another community college. I had taught some gerontology at another community college in Toronto, Centennial College. So it had a little bit of a background. But that semester at St. Thomas in fall of 1995 was a great opportunity for me to get to know you better and to realize just how much we did have intellectually and in other respects in common. I gave a series of public lectures that fall, which played a part in the book that we wrote ultimately called Restoring Our Lives. So that's how things kind of got started for me, and that was 95, 96. One thing led to another, and finally I was able to get on the tenure track, and now I'm retired from that. But during those 25 years, from 95 till now, you and I and others that we have run across in our travels with this whole narrative thing, narrative gerontology thing, I couldn't have asked for a more exciting ride professionally, personally, intellectually, and so forth. We were able eventually to establish at St. Thomas a Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Narrative, or CERN. We were able to establish a journal called Narrative Works. We were able to launch a number of conferences which have continued, called Narrative Matters, which bring together people from various disciplines, various countries who are interested in the narrative dimensions of human life, not just in respect to aging and so forth. So that's been a wonderful feeling of community with folks like yourself and abroad with whom we've worked to develop these ideas concerning the storied complexity of the developmental process and aging specifically. So for me, too, the interest in narrative has led me in directions outside of aging per se. Some colleagues and I did some research and wrote a book on the narrative complexity of rural communities, particularly if you're in one of the helping professions. It's called The Tales That Bind, a narrative model of living and helping in rural communities. Just been finishing up a project with some friends of ours in Houston on fairy tales and revisiting fairy tales that were charming to us as kids, now as 60-plus-year-olds, and how you can get sort of different things out of those simple stories. There are layers of meaning that you can get from them as you reflect upon your own life and your own story. So, an interest in resilience in later life and the narrative dimensions of resilience, how people who have perhaps a good, thick, strong story tend to have more inner resources when it comes to the challenges of aging. So those are just some of the projects that an interest in narrative or interest in story has led me to, but my heart for the last 25 years has definitely been in the area of aging and how we age not just biologically or physiologically and in other respects, but we age, as you would say, biographically or autobiographically, and that inner development is actually absolutely fascinating and every bit as complex as the biological dimensions of the aging process. And there's no end of questions to consider and rabbit holes to scamper down. So, and then lastly, the idea of narrative care as the kind of practical offshoot of or consequence of bringing a narrative perspective to understanding the aging process. That if we can help people to tell stronger stories or to appreciate just how incredible the lives are that they have actually lived, this can do a lot for helping people of all ages, but perhaps especially older adults, to age gracefully, creatively, and so forth. So I think that's kind of gives you a bit of a feel for my story of how I got interested in stories. So I guess I'll turn it over to you then, Gary. What's your story?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I was just thinking that this podcast series is about pathways to stillness and people's journeys to that, how we get to where we are. And I remember we decided to do this episode because we were on your deck, having one of your deck chats where you we watch the birds and go over all kinds of conversations, some silly, some serious. And then we realized that we are ourselves, our own journey goes back a long way, our passion for these phenomena, these concepts. So listening to you, it's very rich. So we are ourselves doing a podcast as kind of hosts and guests at the same time. So thank you for that. And yeah, I will talk about my beginnings of being interested in what, when I look back now as a newly retired professor, and when I look back kind of where I began and some ideas of, as you just did, some ideas of where I got to where I am now. So I think for me, I've always had a passion for the concept of meaning of life, that sort of thing. Probably could start off with the Monty Python movie, Meaning of Life. That would be a non-academic but highly instructional way to look at it. That is one of the, actually sometimes put part of that film in some of my classes, and it gives a contrast to academic work and good humor too. Anyway, the idea of meaning, the idea of journey, and I've also always been interested in the journey, including the the end of life. And that started, I've always felt that, especially when I look back on this, that there's somehow a calling to keep pursuing this, that one thing kept leading to the other. And I just kept following these same insights since I was probably 17 years old. My first undergraduate degree at Loyola, I grew up in Montreal and did my first undergraduate degree. I started off in business administration for some reason. And as with St. Thomas University, you had to take electives at Loyola. And I took a philosophy course in second or third year, I forget. And I just tuned right into that and switched over my major to philosophy, and then became very quickly interested in existentialist philosophy. And of course, existentialists are a kind of loose group of philosophers and writers, playwrights, who are interested in the concept of the question of meaning or meaninglessness. Some of them talk about meaninglessness, but it's the quest for meaning in human life. And another character that was already present there was Viktor Frankl, the survivor of Auschwitz, and very influential, well, in many areas. But he was also one of my books that we looked at in the course. And some of this was kind of new. The study of death and dying was very new at the time in late 60s, early 70s. And I fortunately had a professor who taught a course on death and dying at that time. Part of my interest got generated early on with that as well. And before I forget to mention it, in one of our podcast series, Thomas Moore is one of our guests. And I remember one of the things he talks about is the importance of teachers. And I've been very fortunate along my different levels of studying and learning and getting to where I am to have had good mentors and teachers who really helped me and believed in my work. I think they all said to me, you have to do the work. You have to do the work, but they liked my work and therefore were able to help me to the next step. And I'm eternally thankful for that. I just don't think things might have worked out the way they have without that. I just mentioned even way back when I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy and then I went to do my master's degree, that was already studying meaning. Gabriel Marcel, an existentialist philosopher, who talked a lot about journey, about human beings being en route, as Air Canada would say. So I was already learning about journey. He also talks about the end of life in his version of the journey. That got me into another area, and I also studied some psychology at that time as part of my master's degree on the meaning of death. And Ernest Becker was written one of the classic books called Denial of Death. That's a text that's used still and has always been very central for understanding that. So that was the first, and moving into my master's degree. And then, one of the things I did in my master's degree too, which was kind of good for the consistent with the times, is there was a small group of us who pretended we were existentialist philosophers. And Montreal already had a pretty good cafe scene. And we had a couple of places we used to go to as a small group, in our jeans and shirts and our hat. And I don't know if anybody smoked a pipe, but anyway, we would go to these cafes and we would talk philosophy and pretend we were existentialist philosophers. So that was also quite a wonderful time of life. And at the end of my master's degree, this professor who I didn't have for any courses, he's a sociology professor, came up to me and handed me a couple of books. And he said, here's some things about this field, this new field called gerontology. And here's a couple of books I think you should look at because, he said, there are really no humanists, there are no philosophers that I can see in gerontology. They're all either clinical or they're biologists. And that's not all aging is about. This was his opinion. So I took the books, and it happened to be the disengagement theory, which everybody who is a gerontologist will be familiar with. And that was very striking to me. I thought, well, these are interesting theories, but they've got issues. In my opinion, there are issues here about a wider and deeper understanding of human aging. So I left it at that, and then I moved to Vancouver to study martial arts with one of my teachers. And I had student loans, so I got a job at a bank. And then I happened to be looking at the UBC calendar one day, and I saw this program on interdisciplinary PhDs. And gerontology was one of the fields that they identified as a potential interdisciplinary degree. So I called them up, and they happened to be very keen to have some candidates for this new degree. I went out, had some interviews, and make a long story short, I was accepted. I wrote a proposal and I was accepted. And we identified 3 faculty members, 2 senior faculty members who would agree to be on my committee. These are kind of ad hoc committees that are put together. They're not standard department PhDs. So they can go very well or they can go not so well. And in my case, again, I had 2 wonderful mentors, Shel Rubinson and Michael Chandler. And they were very interested in seeing some new things happen in their own views, their own studies and students. So they agreed to take me on for my PhD. And that, again, was lots of hard work, as anybody who's done graduate work knows. But it was a very rich time and went very well. Another theme I want to throw in here in case I forget as well is that I never really had any money. Right from the beginning, I always had to have a job while I was studying, as many students do today. I was a short order cook. I was a laborer. I was lucky to have a teaching assistantship. My father's company where he worked gave me a scholarship for a year's tuition. There were all these kinds of things that came together to help me to the next step. When I finally got to my PhD, I did get a scholarship from the federal government to do that. So that was a really big help. Anyhow, so that was another rich, and the other thing about this is here I had done meaning, journey, had been given these books on gerontology, just forgot about it, and I ended up doing a PhD in gerontology. So there are all these signs of things that I feel kept me going with this same passion. And then the other big step was when I finished my PhD, James Beeran, who is one of the founders really of academic gerontology, passed away a couple of years ago at 97. I think he was 97 years old, and he worked right up until close to his time of his death. Anyway, he came to UBC, and one of my supervisors said, why don't you go to this conference and be a gopher? You know, photocopy, get coffee, do whatever, just to rub shoulders here. So again, to make a longer story short, I went to this conference and I did that. And he eventually, as I was finishing my PhD, he ended up being one of the external examiners, and my supervisor asked him, and you couldn't get anybody better than that to do that. Of course, if he didn't like it, you couldn't get anybody worse because it would pass or fail. Anyway, so he came up for that to another conference, did my um, uh, external review, and everything was really positive. And then he was having a special year at USC at the Andrus Gerontology Center. So again, my supervisor said, go up and introduce yourself. Don't be shy. Tell him what you're doing, and you never know. So I did go up to him, said, I've just finished this thesis on theories of aging, and that's your special topic next year, I hear. And these were people, faculty from around the world, postdoctoral students, doctoral students. He said, well, I can't tell you anything now. I have to go home and see what the roster is, and I'll let you know. Anyway, he invited me down there for this special year. So that obviously got my career in gerontology really rolling. I was very shy, I have to admit. The first couple of months I was sitting around the table with people who had written the textbooks that I had just studied. And then I was informed that I was there to speak, to share my work, so to get going with it. Anyway, so that again turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful experience. And he helped with letters of recommendation and so on to get me to Europe, which is, if I didn't find a job, that's where I wanted to go. But again, I had no money. They made up some jobs for me around the center to basically pay rent and food, put gas in my car, and that was about it for that year. I really didn't have any money. So my advice that I'll repeat again towards the end of our episodes when we talk about new vision is, don't be afraid to follow your passion, follow your bliss. Yes, you have to eat, so do what you need to do to eat, but don't lose that passion, because you just never know what can happen for you on this pathways to stillness, as I call them in my book, on our journeys. So the PhD was and the postdoc were done, and then the final step in this part of what we're doing is that I remember one of my colleagues, Canadian colleagues, Gary Reeker, who was also at USC from Trent University. And in one day down there, he said, Gary, you do really fascinating work, but you'll never get a job because you're not a psychologist, you're not a medical doctor, you're not a sociologist, you're a gerontologist. And right now, that's not easy. There are very few job postings for gerontologists, except maybe in biology. So I thought, well, I said to Gary, well, I've been a taxi driver before. Maybe we'll see what happens. And however, the universe smiled on me one more time, because I went to Europe for a while, came back, and went job hunting. One of my master's degree supervisor's wife told me that there was this job at St. Thomas for a chair in gerontology, a new program. And I said, well, I haven't had a job yet in gerontology, so I don't think that would be kind of arrogant of me to apply for that. And she said, no, you have to apply for this. So she convinced me, after a few more rounds of my resisting. I sent my CV, sent in everything. And again, to make a long story short, I've said that a few times now, but just not to go into too much detail, I got the position. So, and they were happy to give me a try, because they said I'd been to Europe, I've been to California, I have new ideas. And there were others applying for the job who had more experience, but they didn't have the catalyst. They wanted somebody to really get things going. So I did, and I spent over 30 years there building the program, hiring wonderful colleagues like you, Bill, you have made a wonderful contribution to that program. And it still is a successful program. Students are happy with it. And so now I've recently retired from that, and that's probably where I'll stop this part of the story. I think we will talk about students, about maybe some of the exciting gigs or conferences that we've both had the pleasure to go to in our next part of our episode. But I think for now, that I'll end that part of the journey.
Can I just say that hearing you tell that story or those stories, and there's some new ones I hadn't heard in what you just said, Gary, and some of the themes that you stressed, I hadn't heard you stress them in our many previous conversations over the years. But a couple things just struck me, and I wonder what you thought too, is that the incredible role of serendipity and what I would call synchronicity, and this idea of following your bliss, which is, we get that from Joseph Campbell, don't we? And taking things where your passion lead you, and throwing caution to the wind. And I think that's a common theme between both of our stories. And plus, I'm glad you mentioned mentors and key people who believed in you or believed in me and the ideas that we were each working on, and said, "Go for it. You have to do this. This is important work." And then lastly, the word metaphor, that you've been obsessed. That's maybe this too strong word, but intrigued with, and have spent a lot of time developing the metaphor of life as journey. And together we've been, developing the idea of life and aging as a story. And so the common ground again between our interest in metaphors, our appreciation for the various mentors that we've had, the serendipity of our respective paths thus far, and the synchronicities and coincidences, and yeah. Any thoughts on that? Those kind of common themes?
Yeah, I think, well, there are some self-taught folks, say artists or musicians and so on, who are self-taught, but a lot of stories you hear about people who have followed their bliss or their pathway, their calling, have had doors open for them, usually after a whole lot of effort. I think that's part of it, that you really need to be, like I've talked to musicians and heard musicians say, you have to you have to be it. You have to be it, and that's what you live and breathe with. And whatever happens, happens. Others, take a more moderate view and have teachers, and well, a lot of musicians also have positions at schools and universities to keep things going for themselves. But the mentorship and the passion to just be willing to take a chance, take a risk, and hope that things will work out. I think we all have some passion, something in us that we're kind of called to do. A lot of people don't discover it, or decide that they'll take a safer route, and maybe if I had stayed in business administration, for example, none of this would have happened. So I think there are a lot of folks anyway that I've known over the years who say they just were too hesitant or fearful of the future to really follow things. Now, we as gerontologists see that we try to encourage and see a lot of older adults who have been through maybe a more standard career and always wanted to do something, sort of the path not chosen. One of my good friends in Germany, Willie Mader, who we adopted as a gerontologist, he retired, and then after some years found himself picking up a violin. Now, when he was young, he said, "I could have been a concert violinist. I was that good at it." But I became a professor of adult education and a psychoanalyst, raised a family. So he just shelved all that. But in his retirement, his friends, again, it was somebody encouraging him by someone else, his friends said, "Pick up that violin, take a lesson. You just never know, you might have fun." And he did. And now at 80, he's playing in a violin quartet, and they do, concerts here and there. Just it's all for enjoyment. They're all friends, but they've actually now done some concerts with audiences and so on. And he says, "I'm the most surprised person myself that I'm doing this." So I guess what I'm suggesting is that it's never too late. It's never too late to pursue these things.
It's a fascinating theme in itself. The the unlived lives and the possible selves that we carry around within us. I mean, we've had a good run at it, each of us, and been able to, pursue our passion and follow our bliss and so forth. But there are other things within us that we also might have done. And now that we're both retired, I find myself thinking, well, are there some things that I was interested in the past that I could reconnect with now and open up another dimension of my life as I move into my 70s and beyond.
And that we will consider in our third phase of our episodes, because I think that's a very interesting part of what we're sharing here with listeners and for ourselves too. I just want to make the point that we are gerontologists, yes, but we're gerontologists who look at aging as a lifespan phenomenon. As Thomas Moore said in his interview, we're always aging. From when we're born, we're always aging, and that's not a bad thing. So this podcast series is directed to older adults, but it's also directed to chronologically younger folks who are earlier on in their journey, and there are a lot of similar themes, regardless of what age you are.
I know when I talk with students about thinking about their own lives as stories, and even though they're only, in their early 20s or whatever, they get really excited and they begin to sort of realize that they have a story that they're in the middle of living, just as an 80-year-old has a story that they're in the middle of living. And it gives them a kind of a wonderful, an affectionate detachment from some of the things going on in their lives that may be quite troublesome, because they can say, well, this is just a chapter that I'm going through, and this is not the whole story. And I get to decide, in some respects, the direction that my life story will take.
I think that's there's real power in that story metaphor. And I think, as you say, and I've seen the same thing year after year in my courses with students when they're introduced to the it, when they get the it of story and start to see things around them, people around them, and their own life as a story. It's a wonderful thing to share with students, and I learn from them all the time because they write parts of their life story or share them in small groups, and I think it does give them an insight and another tool is maybe the wrong word, but a vehicle for carrying on their journey as a younger person more consciously and making those choices, as you just said, and also being more conscious of other people's journeys, whether they become professional or informal caregivers or just in their own circles. Thank you for listening to the Pathways to Stillness podcast series. My book, Pathways to Stillness, Reflect, Release, Renew, is available on Amazon, Indigo Chapters, and Friesen Press. It is also available in audiobook form from Audible, Amazon, and iTunes.